The room had not yet gone entirely quiet when Cecily Vane rose from her chair. It was the sound of her standing that did it, the soft scrape of the chair on the parquet, the rustiness of black bombazine against white linen, and the nearest guests turned first, then the ones beyond them, until the movement traveled from table to table like a tide. The wedding breakfast at Pembridge House had been running its warm and satisfied course for nearly an hour. The champagne was poured, the bridal favors distributed, the first toasts already offered by fathers and uncles and old family friends who had each in their turn said the things that such occasions demanded, the words sanded smooth by repetition until they cost nothing. There was no reason for the widow in the black gown to be standing. There was no reason for her to be here at all. She did not look at Mr. Calloway. She had decided that before she stood. She looked at the bride. Dorothea Pembridge sat at the center of the high table in ivory satin, her hair threaded with seed pearls, her expression one of slightly dazzled happiness. She was 20 years old. She had known Edmund Calloway for 4 months. Her fortune, a legacy from a maiden aunt, was £28,000. Cecily raised her glass. "To the bride," she said, and her voice did not shake. She had practiced the steadiness of it in her hired room for 2 mornings running. May she find in her husband's character the qualities his acquaintance reports, and may she find, if she does not, that the law provides more remedy than it did for those who preceded her in his trust. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of a room that had ceased, collectively, to breathe. She set the glass down without drinking from it, and sat. Somewhere behind her, she heard the sound of a chair scraping back with rather more force. She had known Calloway would do that. She had also known, from the moment she received the wedding invitation 8 days ago, that she was going to come. Not out of desperation. She had moved past desperation in the months after Sir Robert died, had passed through it like a season, and arrived somewhere cooler on the other side. She had come because Dorothea deserved, at minimum, a warning. What she did with it was her own affair. If you find your breath short and your hands tight at what Cecily risked in that room, stay close. She had not finished, and neither had Calloway. Sir Robert Vane had been 41 years old when he died, and the physicians said it was his heart. Cecily had not disputed this publicly, because a widow who disputed the manner of her husband's death was, in the season's estimation, performing grief rather than feeling it. She knew what the months prior to his death had contained. She had watched them from the inside. They had been married 4 years when the difficulties began. Not domestic difficulties. The marriage was quiet and affectionate, and built on a mutual respect that Cecily had come to value more than she had expected. Sir Robert was not a demonstrative man, but he was careful of her, and kind in the particular way of men who have thought seriously about what kindness costs, and pay it deliberately. He had a habit of bringing her books he thought she would find interesting, setting them on the corner of her writing table without announcement, and she had understood this as a form of attention she preferred to most declarations. He was 40 when they married, and she was 19, and she had not loved him immediately. She had come to love him over the slow course of 4 years, the way one comes to love a place that proves itself, season by season, to be exactly what it promised. The difficulties were financial, and they arrived in the form of a man named Calloway. Calloway had been Sir Robert's business partner for 6 years before Cecily entered the picture, and for another 4 years after. He was charming in the way of men who have practiced charm as a profession, attentive, self-deprecating at precisely calibrated moments, never more agreeable than when he wanted something, In drawing rooms, he made women feel seen and men feel respected, and he did this not through warmth, but through a quality of focus that worked on people the way a lens works on light, gathering it toward a single point without generating any of its own. Sir Robert had trusted him with the management of their shared commercial investments. This was, as Cecily understood it in retrospect, the error from which everything else followed. She had not known the extent of it until the final 3 months. Sir Robert had kept the worst of it from her. She recognized this later as a form of protection, though it had not felt like one at the time. What she knew was the arithmetic of the closing months. The investments that had performed so well on paper had not, in fact, performed at all. They had existed only on paper. Callaway had been extracting the actual returns for years and replacing them with documentation that looked, to Sir Robert's increasingly exhausted eyes, like reasonable market fluctuations. She had watched her husband age in those final months, in the way that grief ages people. Not slowly, but all at once. The face one morning no longer the face of the night before. When Sir Robert finally understood what had been done to him, the understanding arrived too late and all at once. He withdrew from company, sold what small assets remained quietly accessible, and wrote a letter. He did not finish it. Cecily had the letter still. She kept it folded in her reticule, not because she intended to produce it at moments of confrontation, but because she had carried it for 8 months and had not been able to stop. It was 4 pages in his hand, the ink heavier at the start and growing lighter as the paragraphs continued, as if the hand that held the pen had been losing conviction in the possibility of completing the task. It stopped in the middle of a sentence about the quarter's accounts. She had read those final 4 incomplete words so many times they had ceased to look like words and had become instead the shape of a specific grief. It was the last sustained piece of his handwriting she possessed, and even incomplete it was proof, not of everything, but of enough. Of his knowledge, of what he had named. She had taken it to his solicitors first. They had received her with every courtesy and shown her to the door with a speed that suggested the courtesy had been economical rather than sincere. She had written to a senior partner of the firm. She had written twice. The second letter had been returned with a note indicating that the matter had been reviewed and no grounds for further inquiry had been found. To the Season, Cecily Vane was simply the widow, quite disordered by grief. This was Lady Pembridge's characterization, offered to the Countess Forthwaite in the south corridor of St. George's Church, not 3 hours before Cecily rose from her chair. She had heard it. She had heard a great deal in the months of wearing black, because black made people careless. Mourning dress operated on the social imagination as a kind of invisibility, not through concealment, but through category, as a widow and therefore a figure of pathos. Therefore, she was not quite a person whose perception merited caution. She moved through rooms, and people spoke as though she were a hat stand they had grown accustomed to. Invitations dried up, and with them the occasions at which she might have continued to say what she needed to say. The Season turned its face away with the particular elegance it had long practiced when confronted with inconvenient women. It was, she had found, occasionally useful. The wedding had been held at St. George's in Hanover Square on a dry November morning. The light outside the church the particular grey of London in autumn. Without warmth, but not without beauty. Cecily had arrived alone, which had prompted a small flurry among the ushers, who were uncertain how to place a woman in mourning at a celebration wedding. She had been placed, finally, at the back of the nave in a pew generally reserved for late arrivals and social ambiguities. The church smelled of chrysanthemums and beeswax, and the accumulated effect of too many people in good wool. And the light through the high windows fell in long, pale columns that touched neither the bridal party nor the guests, but simply existed in the air between them, patient and indifferent. She had seen Edmund Calloway from that pew. He stood at the altar in a coat of deep green superfine, his cravat arranged with the particular precision of a man whose appearance was itself an argument. He was 43, and time had treated him with the same generosity it extended to all men who ate well and worried only about their own interests, and he looked prosperous and settled, the face of a man whose accounts were in excellent order. Cecily had kept her eyes on Dorothea's face instead. She had also, in the shifting and settling of the assembled guests, noticed the man seated 3 rows ahead of her on the opposite side. He was tall, even seated, with the particular stillness of a man who had learned stillness professionally rather than by temperament. Dark hair, worn short. The coat was a deep navy that sat well on wide shoulders without appearing to attempt it. He did not look around at the whispers that Cecily's presence in the nave had generated, which meant he was either unaware or had decided not to participate. She found, to her mild surprise, that she did not know him. In 8 months of social aftermath, she had assembled a fairly comprehensive mental inventory of everyone connected to Calloway's circle. This man she could not place. He turned his head slightly during the ceremony, at the moment when Dorothea said her vows, and Cecily saw his profile. His jaw was set with a kind of careful restraint that looked, to her admittedly sharpened observation, like a man attending an occasion he found more difficult than the occasion warranted. There was a quality of stillness about him that was not peace. It was the stillness of effort, the look of someone who had decided to remain composed and was paying a small recurring cost to do so. She filed this away and returned her attention to the altar. His name, she learned at the breakfast, was Nicholas Ashford, Earl of Stanhope, and he was the senior male relation on the groom's side. She learned this from the placement cards and from the brief, somewhat strained introduction performed by Lady Pembridge before the first course, who included Lord Stanhope in her sweep of notable guests with the slightly proprietary tone of a woman accounting for the groom's relations as a matter of social responsibility rather than genuine enthusiasm. He was seated 4 places from Cecily, down the long table. He ate without noticeable enjoyment. He did not engage in the general table conversation about Calloway's prospects and the young couple's future, though he responded when directly addressed with a brevity that was not quite rudeness and not quite warmth. Before the breakfast began, in the interval when guests were still finding their places and the servants were moving between them with champagne, Cecily had spoken to Dorothea directly. She had not planned a long speech. She said, quietly, "Miss Pembridge, I am Mrs. Vane. I knew your husband in his business capacity, and I would ask you, before you begin your married life, to have an independent solicitor review the settlement documents. Someone not known to Mr. Calloway." She had said it quietly and quickly, and with the same steadiness she had practiced. Dorothea had looked at her with the particular expression of a young woman who is frightened of the thing being said, and has not yet decided whether to be frightened of the person saying it. "Everyone says you are unwell," Dorothea had said. Not unkindly. More in the manner of someone repeating information they were not sure they believed. "I know," Cecily said. "Please have the documents reviewed." She did not know, in those moments, whether anyone had observed the exchange. She learned afterward that someone had. Lord Stanhope had positioned himself near the terrace doors during the interval between ceremony and breakfast. For no reason he could have articulated to himself precisely, except that he found the room somewhat close and the conversation heavier than he had the resources to carry. He was 3 weeks back from Portugal, and 6 weeks into an earldom he had not expected, and was still navigating with the careful attention of a man trying to learn a new language through total immersion. He had been at his brother Henry's estate twice in the past 5 years, and neither visit had lasted more than a fortnight. He knew the name Calloway from the solicitors' meetings following Henry's death, where Calloway had appeared among the witnesses as a family acquaintance. He had not paid the man particular attention. There had been too much else to attend to. He had noticed the woman in the black gown from the moment she entered the church, because black at a wedding was the kind of social fact that, once observed, could not be entirely set aside. He had not stared. He had, with some deliberateness, not stared. When she crossed the room to speak with the bride, he watched. She was not disordered. He was precise about this in his own mind, because he had spent the preceding hours hearing the word applied to her with the comfortable certainty of people who had decided, and he had a particular impatience with certainties that wore the costume of compassion. What he observed was a woman saying something difficult in a direct way, without apparent apology or performance. The bride's face changed, not to alarm exactly, but to the particular expression of someone trying to process information for which they had not been given the correct categories. The widow in black nodded once, composed herself, and moved toward her chair. It was a picture, Nicholas thought, and not a comfortable one. He carried it with him to the table and found that it did not fade. He was watching when she rose to speak. He saw the toast, and heard the warning, and saw the way Calloway's face changed. Not with outrage, which would have been straightforward, but with something more calculated, a rapid interior adjustment. The face of a man deciding quickly how to manage what had just happened. That calculation was the thing that stayed with Nicholas afterward. Outrage was human. Calculation was a different quality altogether. The room recovered itself with the particular efficiency of a society breakfast that has absorbed a disturbance and elected to proceed as if it had not. The conversation resumed. Calloway said something briefly to his new wife, who was not smiling, and then rose and moved down the table to speak in a low voice to Lady Pembridge. Cecily sat with her hands in her lap and her glass untouched, and her expression was the kind of stillness that cost something. Nicholas excused himself from the table 7 minutes after the toast and went to find the footman who had shown him in. The ante-room to which Cecily retreated was small and plainly furnished, the kind of room kept for overflow and temporary purposes, its walls bare of the portraits and arrangements that distinguished the public rooms. She had found it by moving in the direction of quiet after the breakfast had resumed, and she had sat in a straight-backed chair beside a cold hearth and allowed herself, for the first time in the day, to feel the shaking in her hands. The cold hearth smelled faintly of ash. Through the door, she could hear the distant sound of glasses and voices, and someone laughing at something, the world reconstituting itself as though nothing had shifted. She heard the door and did not look up immediately, expecting a servant. It was the Earl of Stanhope. He did not say anything for a moment. He came to stand near the window, which looked out onto a small gray courtyard, and she had the impression that he was giving her the choice of whether to acknowledge his presence or not. "I was told," she said finally, "that I was making a scene." "You were stating a position," he said. "Those are not the same." She looked at him then. He was standing with his hands clasped behind him, his posture the precise variety of careful that people carried back from campaigns and never entirely set down. His eyes, in the gray window light, were a dark gray-green that she did not expect. "You were watching," she said. "It was not an accusation." "I was." He did not apologize for it. "Did you see what you came to see?" He was quiet for a moment. "I saw a woman tell the truth at considerable social cost. I saw Calloway's face when she did." I have not decided what those two things together require of me. Cecily studied him. He is your cousin's husband, she said. Whatever I have said against him reflects, by the season's arithmetic, on your family. My family, he said, is a title, an estate in Northumberland that I have visited 4 times, and a brother I did not return from Portugal in time to bury. I am not, at this particular moment, principally concerned with the season's arithmetic. She felt the weight of what he had said settle into the room before either of them spoke again. I'm sorry about your brother, she said. I know the manner of grief, he said. Not sharply, as one states a fact. She was aware of him across the small room, aware of the specific quality of his attention, which was turned on her without the performance of attention, without the slightly elevated register people adopted when they were attending to a woman in distress, and wished her to notice that they were being kind. He was simply present. In the way of a man who had not decided yet what he was going to do, and was not pretending otherwise. She found this unexpectedly steadying. She reached without thinking to the reticule in her lap and found the familiar shape of the folded letter through the silk. The habit of reaching for it was so old, she no longer always noticed when she did it. She noticed now, because he noticed. His gaze dropped briefly to her hands, and then returned to her face with the same even attention. He wrote a letter, she said. Incomplete, in the last month. It names Calloway and the investments. It is not a legal document. It is not enough on its own. It is what I have. He was quiet again. She had the impression he was the kind of man who thought before he spoke, not as a strategy, but as a constitution. The pocket watch he admired this morning, Nicholas said. At the end of the ceremony, when we were speaking to the groom, he said my brother had promised it to him. I had not heard this. My brother's solicitors had not listed it among the bequests. He paused. It is a small thing. Small things are how it works, Cecily said. He looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. I rather thought it might be. They did not speak for much longer. He left before she did, and she was not certain what had passed between them except that something had shifted in her chest that was not hope precisely, the kind she had learned to be careful of, but was in the neighborhood of it. She remained in the anteroom for 10 more minutes until her hands had steadied, and then went back to retrieve her pelisse. 3 days passed. On the morning of the 4th, a footman named Tully, employed in the Pembridge household, was waiting in the outer hall when Cecily arrived to return a borrowed shawl that Lady Pembridge had lent her at the close of the breakfast as a pointed gesture toward making her departure. Tully was not waiting for Cecily. He was waiting for a solicitor's clerk named Briggs, who arrived shortly after, and who said to Tully, in the tone of a man relaying information about the weather, "The widow Vane is quite disordered naturally, and Calloway's man says the investigation 3 years ago cleared everything. Let the lady have her grief and keep her out of legal offices." Briggs collected his parcel from Tully and departed. Cecily stood in the outer hall and did not move for a moment. She had known this was the answer that would be produced. She had known it for 8 months. Knowing the shape of a blow does not reliably diminish the force of it landing. She stood long enough that a housemaid appeared, and looked at her with the alarmed solicitude of someone confronted with a lady in black who was motionless in a corridor. And Cecily thanked her, and collected her pelisse, and went out into the November street. She went to the hired carriage, and sat in it, and thought carefully about what she intended to do next. She did not have the chance. When she arrived at her own lodgings in Russell Street, the note was already waiting. It was from Calloway's solicitor, Mr. Trench, and it was phrased with the elaborate courtesy of a man who has decided that courtesy is itself a weapon. The letter stated, in summary, that Mrs. Vane's continued communication of certain allegations, oral and written, to parties with connections to Mr. Calloway's business affairs constituted grounds for an action for defamation should they continue. It expressed hope that Mrs. Vane's friends and family would assist her in managing the distress she had clearly been experiencing. It wished her, in closing, the comfort that time and proper attention bring. She set the letter on the table and sat opposite it. The room was cold. The fire had gone down during her absence, and the coals needed banking. She did not get up to bank them. She read the letter a second time and then set it face down. And the table was the cheap kind that hired rooms ran to, scratched and slightly uneven on one leg, and the room smelled of someone else's cooking from the floor below, and the window looked onto a wall. And she had been in this room for 8 months. And she thought of Robert. And then she thought, not yet. Her sister, Agatha Morrow, arrived an hour later, having apparently received word from some branch of the Social Telegraph that Cecily's position had become untenable. Agatha was not cruel. She was frightened, which produced in her a similar effect. "Cecily," she said from the doorway, in the voice she used for catastrophe, "you cannot continue this. You will be sued. You will be known everywhere as the woman who disrupted the Pembridge wedding. No one will receive you. You will have nothing." "I have the letter," Cecily said. "An incomplete letter," Agatha said, "from a man who is dead, that cannot be verified, and that you have been showing to solicitors for 8 months, without anyone acting on it." She came to sit across from her sister, and her expression softened into something that was genuine, if helpless. "Robert is gone. You cannot bring him back by making Calloway a villain." Cecily looked at her sister's face. "He is a villain," she thought. "The difference between us is that you cannot afford to believe it, and I cannot afford not to." She said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that would help. She was still sitting in the lodging room, the solicitor's letter before her and the winter dark coming on, when the second note arrived. It was from Lord Stanhope, written in a compressed, legible hand, and it said, in compressed, legible lines, that he had sent Pierce to review the business records of the investment firm, that there was a matter requiring a second opinion, and would she receive him tomorrow morning if she were at liberty. It was signed Stanhope. She read it twice. She folded it carefully and placed it beside the unfinished letter in her reticule. He came at 10 the next morning, and with him he brought a man named Pierce, who was his agent in London and who had, in the preceding 36 hours, examined the investment records of Calloway and Vane's shared concern with the focused attention of a man who had been given specific questions to answer and had found, in the answers, more questions still. Pierce said very little, but placed before Cecily 3 pages of figures with certain columns marked. He then left the room, and Nicholas sat in the chair across from hers. And they talked. What they talked about was, on the surface, the records. Beneath the surface, and never named directly, it was the way the previous days had arranged themselves around the fact of their meeting in the anteroom. He asked questions with precision and listened to her answers with the same complete attention he had turned on her then. She answered without evasion, pulling up recollections of conversations and dates and figures she had not spoken aloud in months, and found that speaking them to him was different from speaking them into the uninterested air of solicitors' offices, different in the specific way that a thing spoken and received as true is different from a thing spoken into silence. Calloway had appeared at Pembridge House the previous evening, Cecily had been told by a mutual acquaintance, and had spoken at length with Lady Pembridge. He had also spoken with the Pembridge family solicitor. His tone, the acquaintance reported, had been the particular tone of a man explaining, with great patience, why a woman's distress should not be confused with reliability. He had referenced the solicitor's investigation from 3 years prior. He had referenced Cecily's continued presence in mourning, 8 months on. He had done all of this with the expression of a man who was performing reluctant concern for the benefit of those who needed to be managed. The season, meanwhile, had produced its verdict with the efficiency it always brought to such matters, producing its judgment that she was a grieving woman who had not recovered, who had attached her grief to an innocent man, and who had embarrassed herself at a wedding that was meant to be a happy occasion. This verdict was delivered at 2 morning calls and 1 card party in the 3 days following, as confirmed by Agatha's increasingly frantic notes. Cecily knew the verdict was coming. She had known from the day of the toast that the verdict was coming and had decided the warning was worth it. What she had not anticipated was the knock. It came at her door at 6:30 on the 5th evening, not Nicholas this time, but a young man in Calloway's livery bearing a card and a verbal message. Mrs. Vane was expected to present herself at Pembridge House at 8 o'clock that evening, where she would be given the opportunity to formally retract her statements at the wedding breakfast in front of witnesses. Mr. Calloway was, the verbal message ran, prepared to be generous in terms of timing. She looked at the card. "Tell Mr. Calloway," she said to the young man, who did not deserve whatever he was about to carry back, "that I will not be at Pembridge House at 8 o'clock. She closed the door and stood with her hand on it for a moment. She wrote to Lord Stanhope. She was not, she told herself, asking him to help her. She was informing him of a development that might be relevant to Pierce's inquiries. This distinction mattered to her, and she allowed herself to maintain it through the composition and dispatch of the note which arrived at his rooms in Jermyn Street at 7:15. His reply came at 5 minutes to 8. It said, "Do not go. I will be at Pembridge House. Stanhope." She did not go. What happened at Pembridge House she reconstructed afterward from 3 separate accounts, one from Nicholas himself, one from Mrs. Fortescue, who had been invited to the Pembridge House that evening for a private supper and who had seen everything, and one from a terse note from Lady Pembridge that contained far more information between its lines than in them. Calloway had been prepared. He had the Pembridges, 2 of their close relations, and Mr. Trench the solicitor assembled in the drawing room at 8 o'clock when the widow did not appear. He had proceeded to explain, in her absence, the nature of the distress she was suffering, the investigation that had cleared him 3 years ago, and the steps he intended to take to prevent further harm to his and Dorothea's prospects. His composure was, Mrs. Fortescue noted, complete. He spoke of her with the careful pity of a man who had decided, in advance, that pity would serve him better than contempt, and who had calibrated its expression with the attention one brings to formal dress. He had not anticipated the Earl of Stanhope. Nicholas had arrived at 7:30, having been admitted on the strength of his connection to the family, and had waited with the assembled company through the period of Calloway's address. When Calloway mentioned the pocket watch his late cousin Henry had promised him, which was apparently Calloway's intention to claim formally, Nicholas had risen from his chair. He had said very little. He had said that Henry Ashford's estate had been reviewed by 3 independent solicitors following his death, and that no record of a promised bequest of the silver watch appeared in any document. He had said that Pierce had spent 48 hours reviewing records, and that the discrepancies Pierce had found were not those of ordinary market fluctuation. He had said, looking not at Calloway but at Mr. Trench, that it would be worth the solicitor's consideration which client he was most materially interested in protecting. Calloway spoke. He named the widow Vane, He said she was quite disordered, and that Lord Stanhope was being used by a grieving woman whose judgment had been compromised by months of isolated mourning. He said this in the voice he had assembled for the occasion, the tone of a man being patient with an unfortunate situation. Nicholas looked at him for a moment without answering. "Miss Pembridge," he said, "is already spoken for. She chose better this morning." There was a silence. In the silence, Lady Pembridge made a small sound that was not quite speech. Mrs. Fortescue, who had spent the preceding evening in an agony of uncertain loyalty, said later that what she had witnessed was a man discovering, in real time, that the architecture he had built his confidence on had shifted under him. Calloway's face did not collapse. It rearranged itself into something careful, and then into something that was very nearly nothing. And that absence of expression was, in some ways, more revealing than any declaration. Mr. Trench found, over the following days, reasons to recuse himself. What Nicholas had said about Miss Pembridge being spoken for required explanation, and the explanation, which emerged over the following week. Dorothea Pembridge had not been at Pembridge House that evening. She had been at her godmother's house in Kensington. She had gone there on the morning of the day following the wedding. She had taken, according to her godmother, a solicitor's card that someone had pressed into her hand at the wedding breakfast, and made, in the days following, 3 visits to that solicitor's offices. The marriage settlement documents had been reviewed. What the review had found was a matter between Dorothea, her godmother, the solicitor, and eventually, the appropriate branch of Chancery. She was, as it emerged, not a young woman whose happiness had been destroyed. She was a young woman who had received a warning in time to act on it. She would not, Cecily thought, with something that was neither triumph nor simple relief, but a quieter mixture of both, be left to learn what 8 months of black bombazine felt like from the inside. Calloway's legal position deteriorated over the following weeks, with the quiet efficiency of a tide going out. Cecily was not there to see it. She did not attend the subsequent proceedings, did not correspond with Lady Pembridge, and did not seek the satisfaction of watching the season revise its verdict, though the revision occurred in full and with the same swiftness the season always brought to reversals of judgment. What she did, in the weeks that followed, was continue to live in the hired lodgings in Russell Street, settle what small accounts remained to be settled, and allow herself, very cautiously, to begin making plans of a kind she had not permitted herself since Sir Robert died. He called 3 times in the first 2 weeks, on each occasion bearing either information from Pierce or a question that required her specific recollection of the investment records. These were legitimate professional calls, and they were conducted in the presence of her landlady, and Cecily did not examine them too closely for what else they might be. She was not ready to examine them closely. She was aware of the warmth in the room when he was in it, and of the specific quality of his attention, which was not performing attention in the way of men who are paying court, but was the actual thing, undecorated, turned on her like a light she was not accustomed to. She was aware of her own heartbeat when he stood near her in the small parlor, and of the way her breathing changed at the approach of his footsteps on the stairs. The space between their chairs felt charged in a way she recognized and did not allow herself to name. And when he spoke her name, Mrs. Vane, in the formal address of their professional meetings, she heard something underneath it that she knew was not imagined, and also knew she was not ready to reach for. She was aware of all of this, and she was not yet ready to name it, and she thought, from the careful restraint he kept about himself, that he understood this, and was not asking her to name it yet. On the 3rd of December, he came in the mid-morning. The frost was on the windows, and the fire had taken well, and the room was warmer than it usually managed. He came in with the cold air still on his coat, and stood in the middle of the small parlor, with an expression she had not yet seen on him, which was something between resolution and the edge of the thing that came before resolution, the last moment before a commitment is made, and the making of it becomes irreversible. He said, "Pierce believes the records are sufficient. The matter will proceed without your further direct involvement. You will be required to produce the letter eventually, for the purpose of the proceedings, but not yet, and not alone." "Thank you," she said. He was quiet. He looked at the window for a moment, at the frost on the glass and the gray December light beyond it, and then at her. "Would you?" he said. "Let me read the letter. Not for the proceedings. For myself." She reached into the reticule without thinking, the way she always reached for it, the habit of 8 months, and found the folded paper and drew it out. She looked at it for a moment, at the creased fold, the unfinished lines in Robert's hand, the place where the words stopped in the middle of a sentence, as if he had simply been interrupted and would be back to finish it. She stood and crossed the small parlor and placed it in his hands. He received it with both hands, as one receives something that matters, and she felt the warmth of him at the distance of a breath, and the frost lay along the lower edge of the window behind him, and outside it the winter day was quiet. She did not move away. He did not immediately open the letter. "The black gown," he said after a moment, his voice low in the warm room. "At the wedding. You knew what they would say." "I knew." "You came anyway." She needed to be warned. She paused. "I needed to warn her." He looked at her directly, and there was something in the look that was not careful and not restrained, the thing that had been underneath the restraint all along and was now, quietly and deliberately, being allowed to surface. She felt it cross the small distance between them, like the shift in a room's temperature, present and unmistakable, and not yet named. "You did not act from disorder," he said. "No," she said. "You acted from courage," he said, "at considerable cost, before anyone was prepared to stand with you." He looked down at the letter in his hands, and then back at her. "I am prepared to stand with you now, if you will permit it. Not only in this matter." The frost held its place on the glass. The fire moved in the grate. Outside in the street below, a cart passed and the sound of it came and went, and left the room quieter than before. "I do not know yet," she said honestly, "what I am prepared to permit. I am only beginning to know what I want again." She met his gaze. "But I am beginning to know." Something shifted in his face, very quietly, toward warmth. It was the quality of warmth that has been withheld a long time and is being released with care, the way a room in a long-closed house feels when the fire has only been lit an hour, tentative and genuine, at the beginning of something. He opened the letter. She sat beside him on the small settle and watched his eyes move across Robert's unfinished lines, and the room was quiet around them, and the light came through the frost on the glass in the particular clear way of winter mornings in London, and the letter lay open in his hands, and she was, for the first time in 8 months, in no hurry to reach for it back. "Thank you for staying until the end of Cecily's story. If this moved you, leave a word in the comments. It matters more than you know."